Is backpacking fun? It's a question that we have debated on this podcast from time to time. There's a guy named Colin Fletcher who would argue that it was exceptionally fun. He's known as the father of backpacking. And while I personally am not a big fan of calling people the father or mother of things, in this case, it is particularly apt as Fletcher really is the guy who kicked off the backpacking boom starting in the 1960s and 1970s. Hi, I'm Stephen Casimiro. Thank you so much for listening to the Adventure Journal podcast. In the third issue of Adventure Journal Quarterly, our print quarterly, whose stories you can only get in print, we did a historical badass profile on Fletcher. And I am going to tell you his story today. We ran it under the headline, Without the Apparent Aid of Logic. The subhead said, Colin Fletcher walked the length of California, navigated the Colorado River from source to sea, and wrote the book that launched a million backpacking trips. Here is Fletcher's story. On a May afternoon in 1963, on the Tonto platform below the south rim of the Grand Canyon, the temperature hit 126 degrees. And Colin Fletcher took off the last of his remaining clothes. Clad now in just his socks, boots, and hat, he shouldered his 60-pound pack and continued hiking. There hadn't really been much to remove at that point, as he was already down to his boxers. But Fletcher was on a long and perhaps lifelong quest to strip away anything that stood between him and what he called getting beneath the surface of things: clothing, gear, people. He called such distractions trivia. As I walked on eastward through my private, segregated Tonto world, exercising due care at first for previously protected sectors of my anatomy, I found I had gained more than coolness. I felt a quite unexpected sense of freedom from restraint. Well, yeah, walking the rim of the Grand Canyon below the rim. Running commando, you would have almost no restraint. But feeling hemmed in really wouldn't seem to have been a problem for Fletcher, especially by 1963. He was 41 and about to publish his first book, The 1,000-Mile Summer. He'd already walked the lengths of California and England and was trying to become the first person to walk Grand Canyon National Park below the rim in one push. He'd never been seriously tied to a job. He was married twice, but neither marriage lasted very long. His prickliness, a side of himself that he called the Welsh bastard, led to friendships that were long distance or loose at best. And he was free from financial considerations or fears, having learned well his mother's lesson that money and material things were unimportant. He once proved this to himself by traveling from England to Vancouver on just $10. But Fletcher wasn't just trying to feel at home in nature. He was trying to merge with it. Had there not been cactus, I suspect the socks and boots might have gone too. The man who would become known as the father of modern backpacking was born in Wales in 1922. An only child, Colin was a solitary, self-contained kid, even before his father ran off to North America in 1927 in search of more fruitful pastures, leaving Colin and his mother alone. He never got over that loss, but when he was 16, his mom remarried to a man he came to call Dad, and he gained stability and grew in confidence. He started taking long walks on the moors, usually solo, and he figured out how to camp in all conditions. When World War II broke out, Fletcher enlisted in the Royal Marines, where he learned fieldcraft and survival skills, including intensive study in navigation. He was in one of the first waves to land on Normandy on D-Day, where a bomb blast blew his left boot from his foot. He searched in the water for a corpse that he could take a replacement from, and then he saw nearby a floating empty boot. Inside was stenciled Lieutenant Colin E. Fletcher. It was this kind of luck that would stay with him throughout the war. His squad of commandos fought its way from France to Germany over 300 days, yet he emerged without injury. But Fletcher did not emerge without impact. The experience left him scarred and unmoored. He married briefly and he moved to Kenya, where he worked on a farm extracting semen from bulls for artificial insemination. He drifted first to England, then to Canada, and then to San Francisco, where he finally settled down. There, he fell for a girl named Thelma Inve Mary, nicknamed Tim for her initials, and they rented side-by-side apartments with views of the bay. They smoked hand-rolled cigarettes, drank wine, dined at bohemian restaurants, and he got serious about writing. And after learning that literary heroes Henry Taylor Coleridge and Walt Whitman took frequent long walks, he started walking too. And perhaps it helped. Between 1956 and 1958, he sold nearly 24 stories. Colin was impulsive, though, and he describes in The 1,000-Mile Summer, "I was lying awake in my San Francisco apartment one February night, worrying about the things we all worry about, when it came to me out of nowhere, without the apparent aid of logic, that what I wanted most in life just then was to walk from one end of California to the other." The idea was crazy. Fletcher had never walked that distance, let alone backpacked it. He had no gear. He has zero knowledge of the desert route. To catch the weather, there was less than a month to plan, assemble a kit, pack and mail food to serve as caches along the way, and then go. And then there was the question of Tim, with whom he'd found love after all those years. But Tim, she was supportive. It was her idea to weigh each piece of gear on a postal scale and trim the borders of maps. She loaned him money, and she rode to the Mexican border to see him off. She even drove his car back to the city. The walk, as he called it, remade Fletcher. He went into the Mojave Desert, doubtful about his abilities, fearful of rattlesnakes, and overwhelmed by the basin and range. Over those 1,000 miles, though, walking slowly and watching carefully, he gained experience, grew comfortable, and saw a rich, interconnected system where even snakes played a role. He was appalled by the scars of infrastructure, which he called man crud, and his skepticism of the human race hardened into acrimony and dogma. For the rest of his life, he devoted himself to the passionate defense of the environment, fighting against man, the insatiable despoiler. And when Colin reunited with Tim 7 months later, she had changed too. She'd had an affair, then got engaged. Distraught, Fletcher convinced her to marry him instead, only to see her flee to the other guy a few months later. His life shattered, he pursued the only action that might bring comfort. He went to England and started walking. Not until 5 years later, descending the layers of the Grand Canyon, did he feel something close to right. Colin Fletcher began his Grand Canyon attempt by crossing 100 miles of the bone-dry Esplanade layer, not knowing whether he would find water or if there was an escape to the rim if he couldn't. The terrain was so complex, it took him 3 months, 3 air supplies, and 400 miles to cover a stretch a bird could fly in a few hours. And when he emerged from the canyon, successful, he was a hero. Although Harvey Butchart was the first to piece together a route below the rim, he did it out of sequence, over 17 years. The public only saw that Colin Fletcher had started at one end and came out the other. Fletcher quickly capitalized on his new fame. By 1968, he published The Man Who Walked Through Time, an account of his canyon trek that sold 50,000 copies in the first year. And he was finishing The Complete Walker, a comprehensive guide to the gear and practice of backpacking. By now, he'd been walking long distances for a decade, and his approach was dialed. He obsessed over lists and sublists. His unvarying routine dictated not just how he set up and broke camp, but the precise order in which his stuff went in and out of his backpack. In Kenya, working on the farm, he had demanded that tools be lined up alphabetically, while little items like nails and soap were organized largest to smallest, left to right, a habit that continued throughout his life. It was this philosophy, salted by his strong opinions, that formed the foundation of the book. Released in November 1968, The Complete Walker landed on shelves in America at just the right time. Exhausted by the Vietnam War, anxious over social chaos, and hungry to break free of the constraints of the 1950s, Americans were ready to get back to nature in a big way. Fletcher's adventure narratives showed them why, and his guidebook taught them how. And overnight, book sales exploded, with backpacks, sleeping bags, and tents not far behind. The cranky Welshman was now famous, and he was financially set. But it didn't bring him serenity, and it didn't bring him happiness. He shied from fans, he put a pseudonym on his mailbox, and he hung a sign on his house that said, "Beware of the man." His obsessions turned to paranoia, and he buried precious metals and gems worth more than $100,000 in his backyard. Yet he still chased that deep empathy with nature, finishing a quest to walk every stretch of the Colorado River from Mexico to the far side of the Grand Canyon. And then, in 1989, he traveled 1,700 miles from its headwaters to the Sea of Cortez, the first person to do so in a single craft. In 2001, at age 79, as he was walking near his house in Carmel Valley, California, Fletcher was struck by a Toyota 4Runner. Though he lived another 6 years, he never fully recovered. And when he died in 2007, his will stated, "Burn me and flush me down the toilet." His friends couldn't bring themselves to do that, but they did scatter his ashes in the nearby Ventana wilderness instead. Fletcher understood that the transcendence he sought was temporary. He said, "The trivia were still there and would be to the end of my journey." But he found what he sought in brief moments of grace, and never more fully than toward the end of his Grand Canyon walk, when he spent a few days on a sandbar watching its residents. With the rock and the plants and the animals, even with the wind and its cloud shadows, I felt now a sense of common origin and direction. A sense of union so vibrant, when I looked back afterward, I sometimes felt that the whole experience was like a perfect act of physical love. For the union was total and natural and selfish and unselfish and beautiful and holy, and at the same time riotously good fun. And while it lasted, nothing else mattered and nothing else existed. That, my friends, is the story of Colin Fletcher. I don't know that I've ever called backpacking riotously good fun, but it is sure nice to feel that connection. And that connection, whether it's through nature and hiking, or whether it's through going fast on a mountain bike or skinning up a pitch in backcountry skiing, I think that is that connection, that transcendence, that flow state. Those are all things that we are seeking in life as adventurous people, and those are the things that we cover in Adventure Journal. If you liked hearing about Colin Fletcher and you like these kinds of stories, then I would suggest that you subscribe to Adventure Journal in print. Our quarterly comes out 4 times a year. It's $60 to subscribe, although it costs $100 if you get it on the newsstand. And we give you free shipping always to subscribers. Subscribe to aj.com. We'll get that to you. As far as the other minor housekeeping details, we sure would love a follow on YouTube. If you're listening there, we would love a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Anything like that will help a ton. But you do you. We're just happy that you listened, and I'm happy that you are still here with us today. I will catch you next time. Peace out.